Hey guys, Tannerbabs here. These are the 3 reproduction carts from AliExpress we're taking a look at today. First off, we have Tanglewood here, which is a game that was solely developed for the Sega Genesis and Megadrive, using hardware that was designed for making games for these systems. Here we have Ultra Core. Ultra Core was recently released in a retail capacity through Strictly Limited Games. Strictly Limited Games releases games for the PS4 and Switch in a limited quantity, and Ultra Core was an unfinished game that was developed for the Mega Drive and Sega Genesis. They took on the project of finishing it and releasing it on the cartridge format. And lastly, we have Cave Story. Cave Story is a game that has been released on multiple platforms, new and old, most recently the Nintendo Switch. Developer Andy Gray made this port of Cave Story for the Sega consoles. But let's go ahead and open some of these cartridges. First off, let's open a legit Sega cartridge. Here I have my Phantasy Star 4 cartridge that we're going to be opening up. I think this will be a good aspect on what a legitimate board should look like before we look at the reproductions. First off, we have the screws that keep the cartridge together, which requires a security bit like this one to open. The back comes right off when you remove the security screws. The first thing we can look at is the board. There's a lot of soldering points when you look at the back of the board. Each EEPROM has been individually soldered in. Reproduction boards are really easy to spot just by looking at these EEPROMs, which makes it tough to spot if a donor cartridge was used when creating the reproduction. For this specific board, it almost entirely fills the shell of the cartridge. Since this game features a save function, you'll also see the save battery here. When we move on to looking at these reproduction carts from AliExpress, you'll see a huge difference since no donor cartridges were used. Alright, now let's take a quick look at some of these repros. Taking a look at Tanglewood, you'll see our first indicator being the screws, which are the basic cross tip. Second, you have 4 clips, 1 on each side and 2 on the top that keep the cartridge together. You have to use a little bit of force to open the cartridge up. Next, we'll look at the board, which you can tell is completely different from a legitimate board. We have little to no soldering and more than likely a basic flash board here. Also, it has a spot for a save battery if it's required. When putting a cartridge back together, you can also notice that these repro boards can be put back either way into the shell. Going back to the Phantasy Star 4 cartridge, it's slightly offset, so this can't be done. Alright, these repros are not easy to snap back into place. The next board being Ultra Core, which is the same exact board as the last. And lastly, we have the Cave Story, which is slightly different from the others, but features the same concept. So let's go ahead and test these out. I'm using the Hyperkin Mega HD and the Retro Freak to test out these repros. These two consoles emulate slightly differently. The Mega HD directly plays the cartridge, while the Retro Freak rips them to the Android operating system and then runs the games. So here's my somewhat janky setup to show you guys. As I go through the games, each seems to work on the Hyperkin Mega HD with no issues. So it's safe to assume that it will work on your original hardware just fine. The Hyperkin has a switch on the bottom to change regions, so for me it makes it that perfect clone console for repros and import games alike. But now, as we go to a system like the Retro Freak, the games won't play. We just get this black screen when we attempt to play them. The console software won't recognize them, but if you have a Retro Freak, you're better off just downloading the ROMs and loading them onto the SD card, which runs them flawlessly at that point. So let's answer some questions about these reproduction carts. Are they hard to distinguish from legitimate cartridges? No, not at all. It's pretty obvious if you know what a Sega cartridge feels like. There's obvious differences like the use of different screws, the motherboard, as well as the weight and texture of the cartridges being different. Will they work on original hardware? I tested every cartridge on the Mega HD, so it's safe to assume they'll work on your original hardware that you may have. When it comes to repros, original hardware actually has the easiest time running them. Would I purchase repros from AliExpress again? Heck yeah. For me, I buy these games to play on clone or my original hardware. Something about playing off a cartridge really makes the difference for me. The prices are fair and somewhat cheap, and the games are obviously repros by their looks, which is definitely a plus for me. I'm about playing these games, not about displaying them or possibly reselling them for a higher price. Not about that life. I know there's people out there that are like that, so we're going to try to avoid that. Something to note about AliExpress is that it's just like eBay or Amazon in a sense, in that there's many different sellers and no one repro might be the same depending on what you purchase. There are a lot of options on AliExpress for repros and hacks, so look around and know that the quality might differ from seller to seller. Last question being is, why did I choose to buy these games? I chose these games because they all have something in common, in that they were all originally made after the Sega Genesis lifespan. They're all homebrews in a sense, and I'd like to kind of point out that there's a reason that the developers of these games choose to go with the pre-order or crowdfunding source to make these games a reality. It doesn't take long for them to show up on a site like AliExpress, and that's just the hard truth about making a cartridge-based game here in 2020. Well, I hope you enjoyed looking at these dirty reproduction cartridges. If you like this, go ahead and hit that like button and maybe think about subscribing. It really means a lot. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.